Hello, everyone, and welcome to session 3 of the Symbiosis conference. Welcome back live to the Oxford University Museum of Natural History. Just a few very quick reminders. If you have any connection issues at any point, do please click the reconnect button at the top of the page. Should you have any questions at any point, there's going to be a panel at the end. Please do ask them in the chat on the right-hand side and click the small circle to the right. That will mark it, that will go red and mark it as a question, and Anita, our chair, will then go through those and pick them up at the end. And just a reminder, this is one of 5 sessions this week, so please do use the link, which I'm shortly going to put up in the chat, to register for the other sessions. Without further ado, I'm going to ask Anita to pop up to be our chair today.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. And welcome everybody to our next session with 3 case studies on the history of Palaeoart. My name is Anita Hermannstaedter. I'm an historian, exhibition curator, and the head of the Department History of Science and Museum Studies at Museum für Naturkunde in Berlin. So it's a great pleasure for me to host this session within the next hour and to discuss with all of you. After talking about our prehistoric relatives and how they might have looked like in different times, now we will focus on the representation of animals and landscapes based on the development of paleontology as a science in the 19th and early 20th century. And I welcome our first speaker, Stefanie Jovanovic-Kruspel, who is the art historian at the Natural History Museum Vienna, working there since 25 years. And Stefanie is an expert on the museum's architecture and decorative design, on which she also wrote her thesis. And her research is focused on the questions how artworks visualize scientific topics and theories, and how they influence the public perception in science museums. And today in her talk, Stefanie will present us the dinosaur hall of the Vienna Museum as a Palaeoart at its own. And please, Stefanie, we are looking forward to your talk. Turn on your camera and your microphone.
Thank you very much, Anita. Yes, I would like to present a very special case study of Palaeoart, the decorative scheme of the dinosaur hall in the Naturhistorisches Museum Vienna. And as time is very limited, I would like to concentrate on 3 aspects of this artwork. The first one is that it is a really unique Paleo-Gesamtkunstwerk, which means it is a total piece of art combining paintings and sculptures. The second point I want to touch is the matter of scientific accuracy in the context of a scientific museum like the one in Vienna. And third and last, I would like to shed some light on the impact this special artwork had on the public and also on the further development of Palaeoart, especially in German-speaking Europe. So let's get started with the Gesamtkunstwerk. The Natural History Museum Vienna was built between 1871 and 1889 by Gottfried Semper and Karl Hasenauer, and it was designed as a Gesamtkunstwerk, which means that all disciplines of art had to join forces to create a total piece of art that was in perfect tune with the museum's content. Together with the museum's first director, Ferdinand von Hochstetter, the architects pushed this idea to its very climax, making the museum a kind of walking textbook of nature. When the museum was built, paleontology was, of course, a very young discipline. But Ferdinand von Hochstetter, who was a geologist and paleontologist himself, gave this new subject a very prominent place in the museum. He dedicated 5 entire halls, and among them, the biggest one of all in the museum, hall number 10, to this new topic. So, and now I will show you the dinosaur hall in the museum. And as you can see, despite the fact that at the museum's opening, this whole the museum had in the 19th century no dinosaur skeletons on display because we didn't possess any, it was still the centerpiece of the museum's exhibition. It presented a collection of fossil birds, a very exquisite set of moa skeletons, Ice Age mammals, and a rich collection of paleobotany. But this hall was not only highlighted by its collection, but also by the decorations. When you look at this picture, you can see that the free zone not only bears huge oil paintings, but also a series of sculptures. Both had the purpose to complement and enhance the collections displayed. I would like to first examine the paintings. When we try to find predecessors for this kind of design, we only find one earlier example in the USA, in Princeton University. The Victorian artist Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, who had created the famous life-size dinosaur models for the Crystal Palace in London in the 1850s, was commissioned in 1875 with 17 colorful paintings showing the phases in geological history and prehistory for a newly established geological museum in Nassau Hall. As you can see in the photograph of Nassau Hall, Hawkins' paintings were integrated into the wooden furnishings, forming a kind of frieze similar to the one in Vienna. We don't know, of course, whether this decorative scheme was a role model for the Natural History Museum in Vienna, but it surely served the same purpose. Both Hawkins' paintings and those in Vienna were intended to convince the visitor of the reality of deep time. The paleontological pictures in Vienna were created by the Austrian painter Joseph Hoffmann. 3 of them are landscapes, and 4 of them are still lifes, like the one in the middle you see in the picture. The landscapes show ideal scenes of primeval times, all depicting topographies which were located in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Well-known places, like I will show you the next picture, well-known places like this mountain range in Upper Austria, not far from Vienna, were transferred into prehistory, taking the beholder on an imaginary time travel. Interestingly, whereas the animals and plants were reconstructed with scientific accuracy, the topographic formation continued to correspond to that of the present. We know that Joseph Hoffmann received scientific advice from the curators of the museum, and therefore the decision to be in this regard scientifically incorrect must have been made deliberately. Obviously, making identification with deep time for the beholder as easy as possible was deemed more important than scientific correctness. When we look for stylistic predecessors, we see that these paintings stand in the tradition of Franz Unger and Josef Kuwasek, also 2 Austrians who had created the first realistic geological landscapes in 1851. I will not go into the depths of this, but I think the pictures speak for themselves. Even more unusual, probably, than the landscapes are the 4 still lifes created by Joseph Hoffmann. Due to spatial restrictions, the artist decided to combine fossil animals and plants in an ornamental manner without regard to exact dimensional representation. These arrangements, of course, remind remotely of Flemish flower still lifes, but stylistically, they already hint into the direction of Art Nouveau. Their resemblance to artworks like the one from Anton Seder or Ernst Haeckel's Art Forms of Nature show their progressive artistic potential. But now to the sculptures. Additionally to the paintings, a series of 24 figures by the Austrian sculptor Rudolf Weyer decorates the hall. Weyer's sculptures are to this day the determining element in this room. Due to an overpainting after World War II, they appear considerably more discreet than at the time of the opening of the museum. But despite that, their peculiar moment of the grotesque is nevertheless dominant and deserves, in my eyes, special attention. Weyer's series of figures had the task to illustrate the evolution of plants and animals during Earth's history in the last 500 million years. But however, any attempt to read this series as a visualization of a specific scientific theory of development fails. Weyer did not want to illustrate any scientific theory, but thought his own artistic and, if you want, poetic approach. The figure's grotesque features pay tribute to their late Baroque predecessors, like the famous Herms at the Wall Pavilion by the sculptor Balthasar Permoser and Paul Egel at the Zwinger in Dresden in the early 18th century. Weyer's figures are in many ways the embodiment of what the word grotesque means. Not only were they hybrids between static elements, in this case the pilasters and human figures, but even their humanity was questioned by references to mythological, fantastic and monstrous creatures. The figures you see here representing a Rhamphorhynchus and an Ichthyosaurus are surely the first scientific 3D models created in Austria, and most probably in the whole of the European mainland. Like in the case of the paintings, the artistic precursor was again Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins with his antediluvian monsters for London's Crystal Palace some 30 years earlier. The example of the Ichthyosaurus illustrates impressively that Weyer's figure is an ambiguous combination of scientific accuracy and free artistic representation. The fact, for instance, that the Ichthyosaurus still features the large scleral rings in the eye sockets corresponds to the knowledge of the time. In the 1880s, it was still believed that these rings had been visible on the living animal. In contrast to this, it was already generally accepted that the Ichthyosaurus tail had some kind of tail fin. You can see this in the image from Hochstetter from 1873. Of course, the exact form was not known before 1892, when a complete Ichthyosaurus tail fin was found. But despite this, Weyer's Ichthyosaurus was presented with a pointed lizard tail, making it look more like a dragon than a dinosaur. And as we know, as he was scientifically advised, also Rudolf Weyer got a scientific advice, we have to assume that this was a deliberate decision, and we have to ask ourselves why. And with this, I come to my next point, the scientific accuracy. Of course, crossing the border between scientific reconstruction and fantastic compensation of scientific flaws is certainly a general hallmark of Palaeoart, making it vulnerable to being outdated. Palaeoart always had to struggle with the problem of becoming anachronistic by the progress of science. Of course, in Vienna, the architectural integration of Palaeoart made this problem even more acute, as the decorations were not removable when outdated. So I would propose that as an answer to this problem, Weyer made the decision to deliberately place his characters at the interface between science and mythology. Many of the caryatids, or figures, especially those which represent sea organisms, are hybrids between nature and humanity, like mermaids, mermen, and green men. The figure's hybridity reminds us of the idea of metamorphism, which can also be interpreted as an artistic answer to the concept of changeability connected to this evolutionary species variability. The last focus point I want to touch just very, very briefly is the impact artworks like this had on the public and also on the further development of Palaeoart. Due to the high visitor numbers, already in the first year of its opening, the Natural History Museum Vienna had 400,000 visitors. Just to give you an estimate, today we are around 700,000. It can be assumed that the decorative program of the hall had decisive influence on the public perception of Earth's history. But the impact of the pictures was by no means limited to the museum's audiences. Photographs of the paintings especially were distributed worldwide, especially via the scientific community. But we will hear about that later. The paleo artworks in the Natural History Museum set an example for the future. The German geologist Karl Alfred von Zittel, who had studied in Vienna was for some time also an assistant at the Natural History Museum under Ferdinand von Hochstetter, was the first to create paleontological wall charts as teaching devices. I show you here some paleontological landscapes of this widely distributed series. So, Of course, World War I caused a disruption and Palaeoart continued to be fostered in Austria. As we will hear later, starting from Vienna and from the museum, artists like Friedrich König and Franz Rubal were to turn the entire German-speaking world into a creative breeding ground for Palaeoart. And with this, I'm at the end of my presentation, and I would like to pass on the word again to Anita.
Yeah, thank you, Stefanie. Thank you very much for these insights into a very opulent paleo artwork and its intriguing and also ambiguous relationship to the realm and rules of science. And following your speech, I have now the pleasure.
Anita, can I just make a very short announcement that Mike, our third speaker, I believe, is in the audience watching now. And can I ask him just to check his email and log in again through the presentation link so that you're ready to give your wonderful presentation in just a few moments. Apologies again for interrupting, Anita.
No problem. So I hope that Mike will be able to join us soon. And I have the pleasure now to introduce Omar Olivares, who is an art historian too. And Omar received his PhD from the National Autonomous University of Mexico with a dissertation about the Mexican landscape painter Jose Maria Velasco. And currently he is a fellow at the Getty Research Institute, and his work addresses the relation between landscape painting, geology, and scientific visual culture in the late 19th century in the Americas. And today, Omar will speak about the transatlantic impact of the Natural History Museum Vienna and its recreation and transformation in Mexico. So please, Omar, show off. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Anita. Just before I start, I just wanted to mention that I began this research when I visited the Natural History Museum in Vienna, and I met Stefanie, and she was very kind and generous to share all the materials she had found, and I'm very thankful for that. Okay. In September 1906, the new building for the National Geological Institute in Mexico City was inaugurated. This same year, the Mexican capital and the building were the seat of the 10th International Geological Congress, the most important meeting in the field. The conference followed the one held in Vienna, and some affinities and correspondences with the spaces and the pictorial imagination of the Museum of Natural History in the Austrian capital can be easily observed. The most obvious correspondence is the pictorial recreation of Joseph Hoffmann's 7 paintings representing the different geological eras in the Museum of Natural History in Vienna. This work was done by the most recognized landscape painter of the late 19th century in Mexico, Jose Maria Velasco. Today, I want to explore the meaning of this imitation as part of the development of the international space of the geological discipline, not denying its status as a copy. I want to stress that a copy, even mechanical, is never a simple or disinterested act. I want to see how essential the dispersion of images and the material environments were for the constitution of geology's self-image in the institutional spaces of the period. A comparison between the compact building in Mexico City and the superb palace designed by Gottfried Semper and Karl Hassenaua in Vienna is impossible. Nonetheless, the Geological Institute, conceived not as a museum but as a center of research, crystallized many of the tendencies that shaped the discipline at the end of the 19th century. One of these tendencies was the understanding of geological research as an international and highly collaborative endeavor, which can be seen as the first effort to coordinate scientific work at a global scale. This was the environment of the first Mexican geologists, among them Antonio del Castillo and José Guadalupe Aguilera. It was possibly Aguilera who, during his participation in the Congress in Vienna in 1903, obtained photographs of Joseph Hoffmann's paintings and gave them to Velasco. Velasco took the photographs as a starting point to do sketches first, and then large canvases similar in size to those in Vienna. In the course of these translations, many items of the original paintings were misrepresented, and some species named by Hoffmann and part of Vienna Museum's collections were abruptly modified. Nevertheless, Velasco added new features to Hoffmann's still lifes. The Mexican landscape painter, a master of perspective, and here we have an example of his large format landscapes, gave perspective and depth to Hoffmann's frontal and almost flat arrangements. By doing this, he broke with the codes of still lifes and composed a scenario or a scene in the formal sense. We can distinguish an example of this in the first painting of the group, dedicated to the representation of the Silurian and Devonian periods. In the preliminary sketch that Velasco prepared, he used a vibrant brush and contrasting colors to transmit the exuberant grouping of animals and plants. Velasco copied the animal forms as they were visible in the photograph. One of these animals in the upper right was, according to Hoffmann's description, a placoderm, a fish with a shell, whereas the other fauna indicate a submarine setting. This figure was depicted as a bird. Moreover, Velasco filled the background with light blue and yellow brush strokes, giving the impression of a cloudy sky. In the final version, the placoderm was represented more as a fish. It lost its shell and its wing-like fins were shortened. The composition set aside the contrast, and the seemingly sky transformed into a bright space illuminated by a diffuse light. We can see the result that this change occasioned in comparison with the original painting. By making similar changes in the entire series, Velasco configured an ensemble of scenes of the prehistoric past, more attuned to the international canon. Velasco, or Aguilera, the commissioner, decided to add 3 final prehistorical scenes to the cycle, borrowing images from the work of the US scientific disseminator Henry Knipe, From Nebula to Man. Although Knipe's book contained representations of hominids, Velasco only included representation of modern humans. The series left ambiguous the implication of representing geological time simultaneously with the evolution of humans. In the corridor of the upper level, where Velasco's paintings were placed, it's possible to see the aim of the decorative program intended for the space. Velasco had to alter the horizontal format of some of Hoffmann's paintings in order to create a unified sequence of vertical canvases. This sequence alternated with stained glass windows showing places considered natural marvels or of geological interest, such as Actopan, in the left part of the image, a place not too far from Mexico City that was famous for its monoliths, and one of the places visited a century earlier by Alexander von Humboldt and popularized through his works. A selection of places studied in the past and thought of as representative of Mexican landscapes form a curtain of scenes that jump from Austrian scenery, in some cases, to recognizable local spots. For the observer, someone who had to walk through these halls, this meant to conceive together an idealized and displaced composition of geological time and a national mosaic of geological marvels. In some sense, it was an attempt to combine the universal geological time with the local landscape. If we compare it with the original sequence from which it was copied and modified, it implied for the viewer an experience fundamentally different in respect to the original placement in Vienna. These elements allows us to consider what the strategy behind the act of copying was. In 1906, geologists from all over the world, mainly European, would have the chance to climb the stairs of the Geological Institute to see a prototypical visual narrative produced by their own knowledge, the prehistoric ages of the Earth visualized in its different episodes. This was the opportunity for Mexican geologists to create bonds with, but at the same time, boundaries within the extended international field of the discipline. Mexican geologists were understandably more engaged with the modernization of their country's mines, the practicalities of geology, and collaborating in the creation of the world geological map, rather than with the theoretical concerns of the discipline, like explaining geological time and evolution together. Other images of the Earth prehistoric past were available in Mexico to create a pictorial representation that could suit the new building, such as the very popular books of Louis Figuier, La Terre avant le déluge, and L'Homme primitif. The decision to stress the connection with Vienna suggests a connection with Austrian geologists and also the inscription of the moment in the context of the International Congress that articulated and coordinated the community. In conclusion, we can take Velasquez copies not only as a simple dissemination of knowledge, but also as an attempt to create a coherent environment for the geological community, according to its global organization. In my view, it reminds us that when we see the geological past, we are also seeing a communal scientific organization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Omar, for your talk and for presenting us an impressive example for creative adaptation and further development of Palaeoart in a global and at the same time local scientific context. And now we have the last case study in the history of Palaeoart. It will be presented by Mike Reich, who is the Deputy Director and Chief Curator of Fossil Invertebrates and Micropaleontology at the Bavarian State Collection for Paleontology and Geology. And beyond this research in the natural sciences, Mike is working on the history of geosciences and paleontology and zoology. And this includes also public outreach programs and museum exhibitions. And with this talk, we will move forward in time and hear more about Palaeoart in the 19th century. And please, Mike, now it's your turn, and I hope that you are with us. Could you turn? Yeah, thank you. Could you turn on your camera, please?
Hi, Mike. I think your microphone is muted. Just make sure that the button next to the camera.
You can hear me?
We can hear you wonderfully. I'm looking forward to your talk. Take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for your inconvenience. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for the invitation to give a talk today within session 3 of our online conference. As the topic of our session are case studies in the history of Palaeoart, I will speak about the forgotten Austrian and German Palaeoart of the early 20th century. So, pictorial representations of prehistoric life has always fascinated people of all ages. First reconstructions are going back to the late 17th century to show Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz here first with the Quedlinburg unicorn, for instance, as you can see in the lower back, built up mostly by bones and skulls from Pleistocene mammals like the woolly rhino and the mammoth. However, the more serious business started during the late Enlightenment with the proof and clear evidence of extinct species based on skeletal comparison of the fossil woolly mammoth and the modern Indian elephant by Johann Friedrich Blumenbach in Göttingen and Georges Cuvier in Paris. Since that time, the artistic approaches to depicting fossil organisms and landscapes changed profoundly, as you can imagine here, with the first reconstruction drawing of the woolly mammoth in the center of my slide, in comparison to a modern reconstruction like this diorama at the Royal BC Museum in Victoria, Canada. With the beginning of the 20th century, only a few fruitful and close collaborations between artists and professional paleontologists to produce Palaeoart existed. Best known is probably Charles Robert Knight and Henry Fairfield Osborn at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, where both produced a large amount of impressive drawings, paintings, and murals. Knight also worked for the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County, Chicago Field Museum, Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., to specify only a few here. With his creative power, Charles Knight profoundly influenced this kind of art on this continent for decades. And in Europe at the same time, one of the protagonists for Palaeoart was the professional Viennese paleontologist Othenio Abel, the co-founder of what we call paleobiology today. Abel was born in 1875 with a strong interest in natural sciences, first in botany, later he moved to geosciences, and he became luckily a professor of vertebrate paleontology in 1907. He also had a talent of painting, and he started, as you can see here, with some examples with pen and ink drawings as well as watercolor paintings. Later, he preferred to use simple pencils, and Abel was a very prolific, productive university teacher and researcher, and later he became chair of paleobiology in Vienna and also later at Göttingen University in Germany. He published numerous textbooks and popular science books, and with these books and his lectures and talks, he also influenced other people. And really, his amount of books you can see probably, hopefully, here on this slide. And he used a lot of his own drawings and watercolor paintings to illustrate his books, but he also used other paintings and drawings by other Austrian artists. And as I told you before, he influenced other people. One of them was Friedrich Lorenzer-König, a name which was introduced in our session very early in the beginning, or with the last slide of Stefanie's talk. And Friedrich Lorenzer-König, who studied at the same time at the University of Vienna, where he got an PhD in chemistry and mineralogy. However, he also visited lectures by Othenio Abel, and shortly after his PhD, he deeply focused on Palaeoart, especially as a sculptor and painter. König inherited his artistic talent probably from his parents, as the German sculptor Otto König was his father, and the painter and illustrator Minna König-Lorenzer in Vienna was his mother. Between 1910 and 1930, he published several popular articles on Palaeoart and also on how to organize better natural history exhibitions for the public. One small booklet from this time is curious. You can see this on the upper right, figuring a large amount of prehistoric animal sculptures made by plaster. And this was published in 1911. At that time, he moved to Munich for a few years and opened there an artist workshop where he produced a large amount of extinct dinosaurs and mammals, which he sold primarily to European museums, especially in the German-speaking countries like Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. A second people who was influenced by Othenio Abel very much was Franz Rubal, also mentioned by Stefanie during the first talk today in our session. And Franz Rubal was a little bit younger than Othenio Abel, and he received a professional training as a painter at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna with Griepenkerl and Bacher. And Rubal was deeply interested in wildlife and hunting, so he focused very soon in animal painting and oriented himself at the works of famous German animal painters like Kunert and Friese. And he, as you can see here, some examples, he produced a large amount of drawings for which he was well known, especially as an illustrator for popular science books and magazines. And at least in 1921, he first met Othenio Abel, and a fruitful working relationship started. Under Abel's scientific mentorship, Rubal also produced a large amount of oil paintings, which are today, for instance, on display in Vienna and Göttingen or Mainz natural history museums, for which he is still famous and his hand specific. However, he also produced several series of sculptures, especially on Ice Age mammals and the evolution of proboscideans like the mammoth or other extinct elephants. Here he always started with a clay model, which were casted then and produced as a plaster model in small series. And sometimes there were also some bronze models produced by him. These series can be found very often in nearly every German or Austrian museum with a natural history collection. Not longer on display, but at least within the collections, they often survived. Othenio Abel and Franz Rubal clearly influenced another important Palaeoart performer of the second half of the 20th century, Zdeněk Burian. Zdeněk Burian was born in 1905 in Moravia, at that time also part of Austro-Hungary. And he started as an illustrator, but later he also collaborated with professional paleontologists, namely Josef Augusta and Zdeněk Spina in Prague. And first paintings were published in the 1940s, and since then, over more than 4 decades, he worked and produced paintings and drawings, and he left behind more than 14,000 pieces of art, including more than 700 oil paintings and drawings depicted to paleontology or to prehistoric life, which were often published and illustrating more than 50 books, not only published in Czech and German, but also English, French, Hungarian, and a lot of other languages. To conclude my short journey into Austrian-German Palaeoart of the early 20th century, there are still several open research questions. The first is related to templates, copies, and art plagiarism. As you can see here, the nice line of starting with Abel over Rubal to Burian with the same subject, the extinct proboscidean Dinotherium in Miocene landscape of Europe. My second question would be the understudied field of the interconnection between representation of animals and progress in research on anatomy of these extinct organisms. And this is exhibited here with the case of the cave, the Ice Age cave bear, Osus pileus. And the last one, a little bit darker probably, hopefully you can excuse this, here would be how the changes in representation were linked to political changes at that time. And this is also to connect to the session 2, here the Neanderthal men, Homo neanderthalensis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much for your talk and for highlighting and discussing a neglected part in the history of Palaeoart. And at the end, you raised a bundle of open questions we could start with, but we also have a bundle of questions in the chat. And I would like to start with the many questions to Stefanie and the statues in Vienna, which seem to be the most intriguing objects. And I would invite also Omar to turn on the camera so that we are all together on the panel. And Stefanie, there is a question by Elsa Panciroli about the sculptures because you mentioned that they have been overpainted. Do you know how they looked like before?
We don't have precise evidence of how they really looked like. We have taken samples to look under the overpaint, and we think that they might have been, in some parts at least, very naturalistically painted. Yeah. We know, for instance, there is a representative of an oak tree, and at the board where the figure turns into the pilaster, you can see branches of the oak tree and a bug, and these details were colored precisely with green and with brown, so it was very naturalistic. But it seems that this was not a coating that was over everything. It seems to be that special aspects were highlighted, colorful, and the rest was kept quite in one tone. It seems to be kind of a grayish tone. But it's also a future research question to look especially at the dinosaur reconstructions to see how the color, the original color coating looked like. And we are still not able to really tell. But from the first samples, I would say it's definitely just a grayish tone, probably with some highlights. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And we have another question for you, Stefanie. Are you aware of the statues and paintings in the museum have ever been under threat of being taken down or replaced by more modern Palaeoart? This is a question by Richard Fallon.
No, luckily, as this is really an integrative part of the exhibition, they were never really endangered of being put away of course, the overpainting is sad enough. Yeah, this is definitely was due to a change in aesthetic experience in the middle of the 20th century after World War II. Of course, historicism and 19th century art was not very much appreciated, and especially we have to also consider that probably the figures had been quite dusty after the World Wars, and so of course there was not a very sensible approach to this kind of artworks, and so this overpainting happened. But luckily, we have to really say we are still a museum of a museum somehow, and this is a benefit that plays out also in this aspect. Yeah.
I suppose the Gesamtkunstwerk, the overarching concept, is also under monument protection, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But of course, still, we struggle with filling the museum, of course, with new scientific content, and at the same time keeping our Gesamtkunstwerk intact. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we have two questions in the remark by Will, and he would like to know a little bit about modern statuary's place in the museum, given our developing conceptions of accuracy. And how do more modern kinds of sculpture and more modern images of extinct animals fit alongside this outdated stuff? And Will also wants to refurbish his home and ask if he could get some models or prints of these wonderful statues.
Yeah. No, we have not yet such models, unfortunately.
Stefanie, we can't hear you anymore. Could you reconnect?
Yes, okay, sorry, I switched off the microphone accidentally. So yes, of course, I think this is a brilliant idea of Will to get these models to furnish our home places. I would definitely also want that. Of course, I mean, as the decorative schemes, coming to the other question, whether it interferes with the modern presentation, we also have to think that this is in the freeze zone of the room. And many visitors definitely don't even notice this decorative scheme because their focus is on the showcases in the museum. So we actually have to guide the viewer to really see the paintings and to also see the the sculptures. Yeah? And that's why the interference with modern narratives is not really an acute problem in the museum. But definitely, I think this is also a very unique chance for a natural history museum like ours, that we can have this communication about our own history and our own change of narratives over the path of time. And I think it's a big benefit to address this matter and to make the beholder and also the visitor, make them aware of this progress of science, and that our perception of what is history and what is real is very much in flux. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Stefanie. We have a question by Oliver Hochadel for Omar, and he would like to know if Velasco did find himself in a certain tension between nation building, if you think of his earlier paintings of the Valley of Mexico, in talking to an international community of geologists with his Palaeoart.
Thank you, Anita. Yes, Velasco has been seen as a nationalistic painter in his landscapes, but he was also a scientist, and he was interested in scientific accuracy. He himself made scientific studies that he accompanied by anatomical plates, such as his 8078 study of the axolotl, which made it known worldwide, and led him to discuss the ideas of the famous neo-Darwinist August Weismann, German zoologist. And this controversy that Velasco made was known in many places. Furthermore, the anatomical plates that he made of the axolotl, for example, which show the fine taxidermy of the animal's lung apparatus, proved to be essential to understanding the biology of the animal. So he was very involved in scientific work. He was a member of the Mexican Society of Natural History since the moment this society was founded in 1878. He did botanical studies. He understood botany, anatomy, and probably he read some geological literature, or at least he listened to the lectures in his scientific society. This specific case in which Velasco copied instead of doing the work by himself is rather rare. Of course, there was a rush of time for the decoration of the building. This may have motivated Velasco to do something more expedite. On the other hand, Velasco was already at the end of his career when he did this commission. He died only 6 years after making this work. So probably all these factors could have influenced the decision to adapt specifically Hoffmann's series. Of course, this was part of when you see the sequence of stained glass windows and the paintings together. There is this attempt to combine local places, as I said in my presentation, with the more universal geological sequence and of course this is very characteristic of the period, like the attempt to create a place for the Mexican scientific community in the international space.
Yeah, thank you, Omar. We have one overarching question by Elsa Pancheroli, and she wrote in a chat, it seems like historically depictions of extinct life in art and sculpture was something undertaken by serious artists and treated very seriously. But these days there can be a bit of a dismissive attitude to Palaeoart by serious artists, and it's seen as something for entertainment. And as I can't imagine building a building incorporating Palaeoarctic interpretation in this way, why do we generally see Palaeoart treated more as entertainment than proper art these days? So maybe Mike can answer this question and maybe explain if he would, and which kind of Palaeoart he would integrate in a modern museum building in Munich.
Anita, thank you very much. Yeah, it always depends, as you know, concerning the audience. So, we have to in our mind also that we always need the finance or the money to do this seriously. So the very professional and very good artists are not that cheap at all, as you can probably imagine. It's hard to say what would be the best to incorporate. As a scientist, of course, we will implement, or we will see the very accurate, detailed Palaeoart. But very often in the museums, the normal visitor can't see the differences and how probably the progress in paleontology or anatomy was over the time. Is probably the skeleton really right, or the skull, the face, whatever. So I think it's to conclude, as I know we don't have enough time. It's always good to have a good public outreach to figure out the former life, the former prehistoric life was, to reach definitely the visitor and the broad audience within the museum. That's the point.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And I think this would really be a new topic, and worth to deep it would be the best contemporary art for natural history museums. But maybe we have another Symbiosis workshop continuing questions like this. So at the end, I would like to thank you all for your talks, and you all out there being part of the discussion. And I also would like to thank especially Jack for the perfect technical support. This is really marvelous how you did it. And now I'm looking forward to the next session, where we maybe will learn how to model our own prehistoric work. Maybe there is also a solution for the decoration desire expressed by Will, and I'm inspired to. I would like to do so, and let's see what we will hear in the next hour. And thank you again, and I hope we see us all in person in the next time.
Thank you too, Anita.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Stefanie, hello.
Omar.
Omar.
Bye.